Good day or good evening, wherever you happen to be joining us from. Welcome to Need to Know, an online series featuring insights from new work in the humanities. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center. The subtitle of our series, Conversations About Stories That Matter, tells you something of what we have in mind. In history, in music, art history, literature, and the other fields of the humanities, how are prominent thinkers reinterpreting our world? The series is sponsored by two leading research institutes, the National Humanities Center and the Stanford Humanities Center. Every year, both centers host fellows who are turning research into books. And what we want to do with this series is to spotlight those books as they first come to light. And in today's episode, we're delighted to explore the work of a scholar who has been a fellow at both of our centers. Now, before we begin, I'd like to mention that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom next to where you see the letters CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow adjacent to the caption icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. I also note that today's episode is being recorded. To get the conversation started and to guide us for the next hour or so, here is Blair L.M. Kelley, president of the National Humanities Center. Hi, Blair.
Hi, Roland. So excited to launch this effort with you and to talk about great books that have come through our centers. And so it's a real pleasure to be here with you. I am the co-convener of this effort, but I'm also here as the conversant with Dr. Rhae Lynn Barnes. I'm a historian of the African American experience, and mostly in the 20th century, but I range out sometime to the 19th. And so I've been fascinated by minstrelsy throughout my career, and so I was really excited to have this conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Rhae Lynn to those who do not know her. Historian, author, multimedia storyteller, Rhae Lynn Barnes is assistant professor of American Cultural History at Princeton University. She also served as the Sheila Biddle Ford Foundation Fellow at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. This landmark book, Darkology, Blackface, and the American Way of Entertainment, was published by Live Right Norton this spring. It came out in March of 2026. It's the first comprehensive work to unravel the history of amateur minstrelsy, mapping the political and cultural geography of white supremacy from Civil War to the present. Her scholarship has been supported by Mellon Foundation, the Library of Congress, and she was a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center. She also has a connection to the National Humanities Center through our education programs, where she's been a contributor since 2019. She's also the founder of U.S. History Scene, an open access digital platform providing resources to thousands of public schools across the country. Her expertise has been featured in the New York Times, CNN, and the Washington Post. She's a product of California's public school system and earned her BA in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and her MA and PhD in history from Harvard University. Excited to be in conversation with you, Rhae Lynn.
Good afternoon.
Hey, how are you?
I'm fabulous. How are you?
Doing fine. Ready to talk about your great book
All
here.
right, let's go.
I was excited to see this title come out, not only because it was a Live Right book where my last book came out. And so I love the Live Right team and the care that they put into thinking about history for public audiences. And then I was really excited to see your subject matter because it's really such a powerful one and really fits in with thinking about the importance of lesser known histories needing to be unveiled so that we better understand our country as a whole. And I couldn't think of a better subject than this. So when it came across my desk, I was like, this is the one I want to talk about. So thanks for
Thank
being here
you.
with us. So for our participants who are less familiar with the idea of Blackface minstrelsy, can you talk a little bit about its background and its history?
Absolutely. And first, I just want to say thank you so much to both the Stanford Humanities Center and the National Humanities Center. Um, I think what's really amazing is sort of the capacious interdisciplinary nature of both programs is what allows for a book like this to be created in the first place that is truly interdisciplinary and tried to take a big swing at a big subject. And so I just wanted to say thank you. So, Blackface is essentially a makeup technique that we begin to see globalizing around Shakespearean times. That basically just meant when a white actor would use whether it was burnt cork or soot or blackface paint to darken their skin for a theatrical purpose. Today it means a few different things. It could also just mean someone in a Halloween costume. But my book is about blackface minstrel shows. And a minstrel show was a three-act part performance, an evening of performance that was performed in blackface, sometimes also in drag. And it would include really the basic DNA of what would become emblematic American culture, whether that was tap dancing, banjo playing, fiddle music, stand-up comedy, ultimately in a three-part performance that was more akin to a variety show in the sense that the different parts were not linear in an overarching narrative sweep. And it really begins to become a clear American craze in the 1830s. There are, as many people on this call might know, about 30 books that are written about the history of blackface, but almost all of them are written in antebellum America. So before the American Civil War, primarily from 1828 to roughly 1860. And then there's a few books that talked about it in the 20th century. So its manifestations in cartoons, film, television, and radio. But what my book does is actually starts primarily at the American Civil War and goes through present day, looking at its amateur form, which I know we'll get into.
Mhm.
But I think the most important thing that you need to know, just to sort of catch up on minstrel shows, is that the number one main character who was invented in the late 1820s was a character called Jumping Jim Crow. And I was so baffled by this dominant historiography and conversation in the books that all argued that blackface began to decline professionally either at the Civil War, when you'd think there would be an all-time demand for this, or that by 1900 it was subsumed into these other forms of multimedia because the form of racial terror and the legal regime that dominates the 20th century is literally called Jim Crow, named after this character. And so I wanted to know, what does blackface look like in the Jim Crow era?
Yeah, absolutely. I first became fascinated with the interconnection between segregation systems, that begin with the first freedoms in the gradual emancipation in the North and Jim Crow, because I think those two times do really sync up, right? It's the first imaginings of what freedom might threaten that you see in the time period before the general emancipation. And so I think when we think of it in that longer timeline that you extend, it makes more sense that Jim Crow becomes ubiquitous with segregated transportation in the North and then later moves south. And so it's really a powerful reminder of that long history of minstrelsy. So what difference does it make to know about something that many people just regarded as humor, as American culture, as jokes? What's the difficulty? What's the shame? What's the problem at the heart of this question?
Sure. So really quick, you said something really critical about Jim Crow, which was it was a Northern invention. The same is true for blackface minstrelsy and
Absolutely.
shows. They start in the Five Points in the Bowery in New York City and then radiate outwards, both globally throughout the English-speaking world. Then it goes through the Pacific. But it's really critical because I think the stereotypes are so strong of romantic ideas about the American South during
Mhm.
slavery and in the cotton fields and singing and dancing that a lot of people just assume that this was a Southern phenomenon, and it's
Yeah.
not at all.
Hmm.
In terms of what's at stake, so that's a huge question.
I
Uh,
know.
one thing that two things that I will say here, and then I'm sure we will develop throughout our conversation. When I say that my book is looking at amateurs, what I mean is that most all of the books that were written, look at professional performers who made their livelihood through blackface performances. And when we look at those numbers in the 19th century, there's actually only about 20,000 performances that happen. During the American Civil War and during Reconstruction, these blackface celebrities do two things. They first found a mutual social aid society, which starts out being called the Jolly Corks, which was a play both on their penchant for drinking, but also the act of actually
Black
corking
men.
up, yeah,
Yeah.
corking up
Hmm.
and blacking up with burnt cork. And then it develops into America's largest fraternal order with 1.5 million members as the Benevolent and Protective Order of the Elks. The other thing that they do is they realize that they cannot keep up with the incredible demand. And so they start publishing how-to step-by-step guides for everyday Americans, whether it's in schools, churches, and fraternal orders, to learn how to perform in blackface in a way that was racially and stereotypically funny to embody Blackness. And the book's titled Darkology. Some people think I made this word up. I actually learned it from Bing Crosby, and it was basically insider slang developed by blackface performers to basically mean the act of, as they believed, learning to inhabit a racially authentic representation of Black music, song, dance, and also stereotypes through gait, facial expressions, and things like that. When we look at the amateur form, there's actually 1 million shows a year in the 20th century. So it actually only accelerates and democratizes. And what's critical about that is two things. Now, all of a sudden, you have Americans shifting from being passive consumers watching shows to now physically embodying and creating and memorizing and publicly staging their own interpretations of Black caricature for their
Mhm.
communities. And also their charity shows, which at first blush sounds like, well, this is horrible, but at least the money is going to something good. But when we go back to the fact that these are happening in the context of the Jim Crow economy, that means that all of the money raised, whether it's for a hospital or a school or a church, actually is only strengthening the racially segregated healthcare system, education system, worship, etc. And so there is a direct link between political power and the Jim Crow economy and this blackface minstrel tradition.
It was really powerful. And reading it, it really helped me understand some things that I had discovered in my own research. I wrote about Black women who did laundry, washerwomen, and then I discovered the phenomenon of bridal showers that included blackface,
Wow.
where the linens that were given to brides were given by people blacked up in full costume as washerwomen in someone's backyard just to celebrate at a bridal shower. So I thought it was really powerful to really, I felt like that was a scratching over the surface of sort of the way in which blackface was part of the culture and just, the joke that everyone wanted to tell in their own homes, at their own parties, in their towns and cities across the country. And so it's really a powerful reminder of why when we see it in the 1960s or 70s or 80s or 90s in fraternities at different universities around the country, there is this through line. It's not a throwback. There's a through line, and so I thought that was really powerful. What is the draw? What's the draw? Do you think
Great
to
question.
to continuing to do this portrayal, this very stereotypical and awful portrayal of Black people?
Yeah, so there's a lot of pushes that I think previously we hadn't talked about in this historiography. So Eric Lott, in his brilliant book
Mhm.
Love and Theft, talks about sort of this idea of attraction and repulsion from
Hmm.
white performers or audience members who are watching basically stolen Black genius in musical and performance forms of expression. David Roediger talked about the ways in which it was central to the development of the white working class. And both of those conversations were taking place in antebellum America. What's really interesting and powerful is when you look at it in amateur form, it no longer just becomes white people performing it. And part of that has to do with something that happened during Roosevelt's tenure as president, which is he basically federalizes blackface, both in the Great Depression under the Works Progress Administration,
Mhm.
which is one of the most amazing things that ever happened in the United States in terms of putting so many out of work actors and writers and historians back to work. But that included a huge wing of the federal program dedicated to blackface music. And part of what they were arguing was that they believed that blackface was the ultimate form or contribution of American culture
Mhm.
globally as a cultural export. And that in a moment when it seemed like all of the arts were collapsing, that if you were to try and save something that was emblematic of American
Mm.
culture, then you needed to save blackface. And so, in terms of motivations for the average American, over the course of generations, they're taught that performing blackface is not only tied to ideas of whiteness, but also tied to ideas of American identity and American patriotism, of uplift. And so it begins to expand as something that's of interest to, for example, Japanese Americans and Black Americans who are trying to get on the stage, and that's the only avenue in which they can practice performing publicly. And so there's a lot of different motivations for different groups. But overall, this sort of driving stand-in as an identifier for American and Americanization really kicks it up to a whole nother level where it's no longer just about whiteness.
I always found it so powerful to talk with my students about that they know the tunes of Blackface, that those are familiar to them. So, what are some of the ways in which it's still with us in our culture and ways that are less um, acknowledged now?
Yeah, so the ice cream truck song is the theme song for Jim Crow's foil, which is a character named Zip Coon. So Jim Crow is sort of supposed to be a bumbling, rural, uh,
The
normally,
traveling intruder, the
yeah,
wheeling stranger.
the troubadour, normally represented in the American South,
Yes.
being happy to be enslaved because of the white supremacist ideas that slavery benevolently gave free clothing, free housing, free food. Zip Coon is the foil. He is an urban dandy. He's a political junkie. He often tries to dress very ornately, but always just sort of gets things wrong. So his theme song is the ice cream truck song.
Mhm.
And then, of course, there is the Stephen Foster canon. Stephen Foster is a white man born in Pittsburgh who then becomes the number one composer for blackface sheet music in the 1840s, the 1850s. He dies very young, both impoverished in New York City and also very much stricken with alcoholism. But he writes songs like Camptown Races, Oh Susanna. And I think Oh Susanna is a really interesting case study because most of us learned it as children. Once again,
Mhm.
these forms of music that are really identified as critical for every American citizen to know to understand our cultural heritage. And where I grew up in California, it was often presented as a Western song, that this was something the cowboys sang,
Mm.
because of the ways in which that the 49ers and the gold miners really embraced this music. But these were men who basically had left the Bowery in New York. They go out to San Francisco. They're performing in amateur form, but also going to the major concert saloons out west and learning the songs through sheet music and through photography and these new forms of multimedia in the mid 19th century that are really changing and exploding entertainment. What I stress to students is go back and read those lyrics because
Mm.
what's actually happening in that song is not a cowboy or a gold miner who is talking about leaving his family back east. It is portrayed and performed in blackface in a minstrel show where you are watching an enslaved man who is an enslaved artisan, the banjo on my knee, come from Alabama down to Louisiana, and he is talking about his experience in the internal slave trade when 1 million enslaved Americans were forcibly ripped from their families and traded down south, down into sort of deeper cotton or sugar plantations. And he's telling Susanna, who is most likely his wife, though not legally recognized as such, not to cry while they're being separated on the auction block. The song also uses pretty vile racist language and also talks about massacring Black populations. And so these were performed in a way that was meant to be funny and then have been handed down as American iconography to school children.
It's really interesting to me how much it's still around us and part of the script of American life. Do your ears hang low? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. So many different ways in which it's part of the childhood rhythm. At least that I grew up with in the 20th century. I don't know if it's as ubiquitous, but probably well known still
It
now.
If you go to a toy store, it's still pretty hard to find toys that don't play these songs. And part of what I was really fascinated with is how does Stephen Foster music become sanitized over time? And it
Mhm,
really is that moment of federalization because what's
mhm,
key there is it puts all of this music into public domain. And once it's in
mhm,
public domain, it can be used for the background of cartoons like Warner Brothers. It can be
mhm.
used by sheet music in schools in K through 12 and also later on in video games, all kinds of ways it manifests.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I think even in the art of the cartoons that young people saw as young people, it's blackface is everywhere and sometimes very obviously so.
Absolutely.
Um, so that leads me to think about the question of hidden history.
Mhm.
Um, you frame this as a hidden history, and in certain ways it is, right? The longer tangles of connection are lost to many Americans. But for some Americans, it is very obvious, very connected. It was a script that, my mother talked about. She talked about Amos and Andy. She talked about those songs. She talked about Blackface when I was growing up because she saw it as a threat. That there were people who were trying to keep up stereotypes as a way to keep Black people away from those towns, away from those organizations, away from those institutions. And so I wonder when we think about hidden history, hidden from whom, hidden where, hidden how might be a challenge I might want to use it to piece through for me.
Yeah, so I did not use hidden history in the book title, but it was in my dissertation. And in some ways, I thought that phrase has been really overused. But in my case, the archives themselves, as a historical body of evidence of a cultural hate crime, were actively hidden. And so I'll go into that in a moment. But you're completely right, because if you speak to almost anybody of a certain age, this was ubiquitous in American life. You could not get away from it, not just in terms of the blackface minstrel show performances, but as we're talking about, that it's on tea doilies, it's on, Aunt Jemima cookie jars. So, like, the manifestation of the characters also takes on its whole other life in the materiality of everyday American society. But what I had discovered is why had all of these historians who are, the most brilliant people and dear friends of mine, why did they continually argue that this had died out either at the turn of the Civil War or at the turn of the 20th century? And one sort of nerdy thing that I noticed early on was that while writing about the 1830s, 40s, a lot of times they were citing texts that were actually published in the 1930s and the 1940s. And I was trying to
Mhm,
figure out what was going on there. And that was when I realized that they were looking at the federal
mhm,
reviving of blackface minstrel shows. But in terms of doing my own research for this book, part of why it took so long was really because I had to personally piece together archives myself.
mhm,
There
mhm,
was no specialized archive in the United States for amateur blackface. The Library of Congress did not have a way to classify this genre. So I
Mhm.
would find them from everything from, things like opera and ballet, all the way
Mhm.
to the most typical way they're classified is Black Americana, which
Hmm.
drives home this idea that this is an accurate representation of Black
Hmm.
culture when it should be white supremacist culture, and that once again, it is still this embodiment of America, and that it's our sort of one true art form. Um, but what you're also sort of speaking to is the ways in which Black mothers, and I know we'll get into this, are really critical in
Mhm.
sort of taking down this juggernaut of an industry, in exactly the way that you mentioned, in terms of trying to teach and protect their children. Um, would you like me to talk a little bit about how?
Yes, I love it. Of course, that's where I was going.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so reconstructing the archives was complicated. Part of it because of my positionality. I am
Yes.
not a white man. And so if I had been a white man, I could have just joined, for example, the Elks Club and got the rosters of the membership. But I couldn't do that. They were normally always protected. And so
Hmm.
I had some very funny experiences while a graduate student, where I would try to go, for example, to the Elks National Headquarters in Chicago, try to do research, and they were very shockingly open about the blackface connection. It's on all the walls. There was an exhibition
Mhm.
downstairs with all the American presidents who had been Elks, which is most of them through
Hmm.
um, Ford. And then when I asked, can I see the actual library? Could I see the membership rosters? They got really defensive and sort of pushed back to the point where I was pretty much carried out like a lady by security. And they jokingly called me the Aaron Brockovich of blackface. And I laughed because I was like, I understand that you're trying to make fun of me as a woman, a curvy woman, a woman who grew up more working class. Like, I get what you're trying to
Mhm.
do. But
Hmm.
she wins in the end. Like, go ahead
Yeah.
and call me that. Like, we will
We
see
know
how
her
this
name.
turns out. Yes. So I just kind of took that as like, okay, go ahead and call me that. The other major thing that was sort of two things was during Barack Obama's ascent, which is when I really
Mhm.
started this project. I often found that libraries and local historical societies were discarding this material.
Mm.
Basically, I was often told, we have a black president now. Don't dig up this, ugly history is normally the phrase that they would use. Just let it be, let it remain buried. As we know, Barack Obama did not end racism in America, in any capacity. And I was really driven by the idea that if I could prove how blackface stereotypes were constructed, how they
Hmm.
were circulated, and step by step show how they were handed down intergenerationally to the point
Hmm.
where we have children in the 1970s singing line by line, word for word, songs and plays that are written by white supremacist, anti-abolitionist
Hmm.
slaveholders in the 1830s and the 1840s and the 1850s, why we have this continuity of white supremacist ideology. And that if I could show that, it would show that it's fake, that it's made up, and would empower those of us who were involved in things related to Trayvon Martin or Oscar Grant, or then later George Floyd,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
ways in which the stereotypes that were mobilized against these children and men were in
Hmm.
fact nonsense. They were social and
Hmm.
cultural constructions.
Hmm.
Um, so that really became the driving force to keep pushing in terms of trying
Hmm.
to create the archive. And then in terms of actually making it, my family helped. There was a lot of
Hmm.
searching for this material. Americans started sending it to me. There's sort of
Hmm.
disturbing family memorabilia. And then it got to the point where once institutions recognized what I was doing, that I was able to gain access that had previously been restricted.
Yeah. It's really a powerful reminder of the sort of archival trails that so many historians really have to track down, and you definitely, track them down. to make sure that you could make that argument grounded in a material history that I think is so important to preserve, so that we have that through line.
Yeah,
I think is so important.
absolutely.
So if we could just be a little more interdisciplinary and think
Love
about the psychological, what's the thing that feeds American culture in this stereotype? What's the give? What's the squeeze of minstrelsy for white Americans, for people trying to become white Americans as they come to this country? What's the attraction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that going back to sort of the Eric Lott premise, there is Black genius in performance. One thing I tell my students is, and I'm in no way saying that anything about slavery was positive, but when you take 12 to 15 million people from diverse places in West Africa, take them into the Caribbean and then into the United States, the forms of cultural creation are unlike anything the world had ever seen because these were global people by force. And also, things like the banjo is an
Mhm,
African instrument, and we think of it
mhm,
as an American instrument, but it's
mhm,
not. And so that sort of pressure cooker of people having to create with nothing while on a
mhm,
starvation diet, often performing under torture. You
mhm,
need to dance faster, you need to sing better in order to get food, perhaps. Um, really unfortunately is innovative. And white Americans see that and steal it and they profit from it. And so what becomes Broadway, what becomes variety show, what becomes television and film as we know it are really based on the performance genius of enslaved artisans. And that was something that was very openly spoken about in antebellum America. Most of these mega performers would say, I learned this song, including the Jumping Jim Crow song,
mhm.
from
Yeah.
an enslaved artist. And so I was really curious, like, what are they doing? And they're basically going to places like Charleston and New Orleans, where any white person, whether or not you were going to actually purchase and enslave somebody, could demand that an enslaved artisan perform for them. And they not only had no right over their body, but also the products of it, whether that was a song or a dance or choreography, and would steal it. And this is, I know, is something that a lot of musicologists and uh, performance theory scholars are really trying to break down right now is how
Mhm,
does that transfer from an enslaved form of artistry to then something that is mass copywritten and commercialized.
mhm. I also wonder what is the joke of minstrelsy? Why is the joke continuing to be funny? Most time if we heard a joke before, that gets old. But it's really powerful to see a through line of humor as well in terms of white audiences seeing Black people as disposable, um, uh, out of place in the world, inadequate for freedom. Why is that a joke that generations want to tell again and again?
And even on the most basic level, some of the, why did the chicken cross the road?
Yeah,
That is a minstrel joke. That was
yeah,
a
yeah.
typical um, pattern. But yes, I mean, the majority of all of the jokes pretty much come down to racial inadequacy, whether it's dealing with technology, dealing with
Mhm,
voting, dealing with education. And so that obviously makes the person who's watching and laughing at it feel superior.
mhm,
And also, laughter is an instant community builder. And so
mhm,
you are part of a group laughing at another group that is instantly divided between each
mhm,
other. Um, and then I think what becomes really disturbing with the how-to guides and joke books is it's then asking everyday Americans, including children, to take the jokes that they think are most interesting and funny about Black America and string them together into an act or an evening performance. And so then you also
mhm.
have this other sort of ownership of this content.
Yeah.
that is unlike what's happening in the professional performances.
Yeah, I thought that was really, powerful that, community theater as Blackface was really being made again and again and again. And it could be responsive to the politics of the time. It could be, that pushback against the threat that I think is so interesting.
One thing that's critical too about comedy and the joke is the complexity of it when non-white performers are engaging in this. And what I mean
Mm,
by that is, for example, giants of entertainment at the turn of the 20th century, whether it was Bob Cole, James Weldon Johnson, uh, uh, you know, W.C. Handy. I mean, I could just rattle off an enormous list of Black performers who were composers, stand-up comedians, sometimes performing opera, who really were forced to make their initial performances in the Blackface tradition. But what they would do was engage in satire, that when they were performing for a Black audience, they were critiquing the experience of
hmm
a Black American in the United States, but white audiences did not understand the complexity and
The
continued to
layers.
see
Yeah.
it as this flat line, as if it was self-lampooning. And that
hmm
was something that a lot of these performers, in really devastating ways, often in terms of racial violence while on the touring circuit, realized they are not understanding what I am actually doing here. Um, to the point where we unfortunately lose a generation of Black genius by people who were essentially, the phrase they used was driven mad by the minstrel
hmm
mask.
Yeah, absolutely. So resistance to minstrelsy. Your book talks about the ways in which people are fighting back against it and understood the harm and the violence at the heart of it. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, from its inception, there were people like Frederick Douglass, abolitionists, who were very critical of this form and understood why it was so detrimental to American equality. Um, One reason it was very important for me to nail down and give extreme detail and texture in my writing to the lives of the primarily Black mothers who fought
Mhm.
and Black college students who fought against minstrelsy was one, I wanted to show how dynamic and beautiful and detailed their life was compared to an art form that tried to just make everything one-dimensional. But more importantly, the argument in all of the historiography that it just died out either due to lack of
hmm
interest by the audience or because it was subsumed into mass media erases this incredible intergenerational fight by Black Americans and sometimes with allies, whether it was Jewish Americans, etc., Quakers,
hmm
um,
hmm
to take down this industry. So the story really begins to turn. We have a few flash moments that are familiar, like the release of Birth of a Nation in
hmm
1915, which is
hmm
the typical story in the ways in which the NAACP's first national campaign was an anti-blackface campaign in relation
Yes,
to that movie. Uh,
yes, absolutely.
but when we get to World War II, Roosevelt has federalized blackface in the WPA. And then it ramps up one more time during World War II when we have 16 million Americans
hmm
who are fighting abroad and hundreds of millions who are domestically dealing with different home fronts. And blackface is central to ideas of um, patriotism, but also uplift and also
hmm
renewal in World War II. And so for the first time, you have a congregation of Black men and Black women who are fighting in the double victory campaign, freedom at
Yes.
home and
hmm
freedom abroad, who are putting their life on the line, fighting in places like the Pacific Theater. And the only recreation that they get, they are shocked to discover, are blackface performances that they are either forced to perform in themselves or watch. And so they begin to organize and write to the NAACP and argue intellectually why this is not American culture, why this is derogatory. They try to
Mhm.
develop sort of historical empathy. But that ratchets up again in the 1950s when we have many of these Black Rosie the Riveters who are now on the front lines of home desegregation and school integration with their baby boomer children, who are horrified to discover that the thing that their children are learning in English class, history class, music class, you name it, about Black America is only minstrel shows. And so
Mhm.
one of the heroes that I truly mean heroes that I talk about in the book is a woman named Betty Reed Soskin, who sadly just passed in December at the very young age of 105, who lived many, many profound lives in America, but her last sort of major accomplishment was being the oldest serving national park ranger at 100 years
Mhm.
old.
Mhm.
And she spent a good portion of the middle of her life fighting against blackface after her son had integrated a school in Walnut Creek in Northern California after her and her husband had served, and recognized that even though her and her husband owned what was called a race record store back then,
Mhm.
essentially
Mhm.
jazz, soul, R&B music, and she was a cultural tastemaker for Black music, was horrified to discover that the entire school was raising money from the PTA to the principal using these Stephen Foster songs where they were portraying Black children, like her son, as wearing raggedy clothing and bumbling and stuttering and all of the stereotypes that we have encountered. And she talks about understanding the full depth of W.E. Du Bois's double consciousness, that she was
Mhm.
literally sitting in an audience watching an entire community develop and form around laughing at her and her child, and she protests it. And she basically, after confronting the principal, says, I can't stop you, but you're going to perform that in front of me and you're going to look me in the face while you do it. And so she then joins the NAACP, and there is a coordinated effort, both a writing campaign and also legislative and judicial campaign, to try and get this out of California public schools.
Mhm.
The other wing of this is on college campuses. So
Mhm.
many universities, especially on the East Coast, were direct beneficiaries of either the slave market or actually holding enslaved people on college campuses. And
Mhm.
after emancipation, there was a vacuum of labor and finance. And so almost immediately, most of the major universities begin to use blackface as a way to raise money for athletic teams, to build a new church, I was gonna say castle, a new cathedral on campus,
Yes.
castle learning. And so you also have this intergenerational issue with blackface on college campuses, the longest one being the University of Vermont that runs from 1893 up to 1969 every single year, making the equivalent of millions of dollars a year for the university. And that's to say nothing of all of the local businesses, the hotels,
Mhm.
the restaurants that profit off of this annual Blackface Festival. And it comes down to college students who had integrated and joined the University of Vermont to educate the student body, to educate the president of the university, and most fraughtly, the alumni, um, in terms of what this meant. And a lot of great migration mothers and civil rights mothers are very clear in saying to men in the civil rights movement, you're trying to marginalize this issue, but if you want to understand lynching, if you want to understand disenfranchisement, you need to understand the power of these stereotypes and the prevalence that they have in everyday American life to understand why this violence keeps perpetuating.
Yeah. It's a really profound story in so many different kinds of directions, and the ways in which dehumanization became everyday is really demonstrated so interestingly in this book. I really appreciate it. So I want to open up for questions
Okay.
from the audience, and I also want to announce that we're giving away books as part of this series, and so our book winners are Kara Smelter, James Ward, and Sylvia Tamash. So, congratulations to those three. You're getting a really good uh, and careful read that I think is going to illuminate a lot of history. So, the first question from our audience, is it fair to conclude that Blackface historically involves performances primarily by white men? Like, why, if it's they're the main drivers, what's the reason behind their role in this?
Absolutely. So it starts where blackface originates. Jumping Jim Crow was unleashed in the Bowery and the Five Points in New York City. And at the time in the 19th century, theater was very different from how we understand it today. It was primarily in concert saloons, which was an all male space unless you were a sex worker. And so the moment blackface explodes onto the scene, it is identified as an activity of white men due to the
Mhm.
space in which it was created. It was also very much associated with drinking and sort of a physical um,
Mhm.
bodiness.
Mhm.
And then when it is subsumed into the military and fraternal orders and universities, which at the time were primarily only white men, it really is entrenched as this thing or this unique space where white men can sing publicly, they can dance publicly, they can touch each other publicly in a way that was read as masculine. They often say he-man entertainment. And
Mhm.
then at the core of what it means in a devastating way to be a white man is
Mhm.
to engage in racial terror.
Yeah.
It's very rare to find women performing for
Mhm.
most of American history.
So the next question really touches on that in terms of the portrayal of Black women characters by men as drag performance. The question mentions documentarian Marlon Riggs and his film Ethnic Notions talking about that. And so I think, really the dehumanization of Black women as manly and portrayed by men, I think also connects to the way you explain the origins of Blackface.
Absolutely. So if you've never seen Ethnic Notions, you can watch it online through the California Newsreel, and it is a perfect study of the things like the Jemima character and all these
Mhm.
different manifestations in daily American life. When we look at straight minstrel shows in the 19th century, as I mentioned at the sort of top of our conversation, they performed in blackface and drag. And
Mhm.
during American enslavement, the representation of Black women was normally as a mulatto temptress or wench character in which she was supposed to be very sexually seductive, beautiful. Um, Obviously, they don't use the term trans in antebellum America, but a lot of the performers would say, I am not actually inhabiting drag. I just am a woman, even though they would have been read biologically signed men at birth. Um, and so their accounts of inhabiting Black womanhood is quite interesting. But what I think is fascinating is with emancipation and the rise of amateur shows, that character disappears, the idea of the
Mhm.
tragic mulatto. She's replaced by Mammy, who is
Mhm.
normally portrayed as desexualized.
Mhm.
He's always wearing a servant uniform. And so the ways in which when we needed the slave population to be reproducing, it's this sexual temptress. And then after emancipation, when there is a sort of federal attempt to clamp down on Black reproduction, she then becomes the mammy or the laundress.
Mhm.
In ways that are responding to real-time culture. And one thing that's very bizarre about blackface is while the stereotypes are often static, they interact with technology and politics. So I always kind of say it's like if you took The Daily Show and Rocky Horror and put it in a midnight screening where you constantly have different changing political commentary and satire, but then there are
Mhm.
these lines and gags and jokes that everyone knows and screams out at the same time.
Mhm.
And so that's sort of another dimension to the drag that's being mobilized in these shows.
Absolutely. Another question is, the questioner said, when my daughter was younger, I was able to get music together to remove a few songs like Jimmy Crack Corn and others off their rotation of songs taught to kids. They told me that these songs were part of America until a Mercury News reporter and music professor from Berkeley helped me. I did not want kids singing these songs as playground music around my child. What else can we do to make people aware of these horrible biased songs?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you did is exactly right. And this is what Betty Reed Soskin and Linda
Mhm.
Patterson and other heroes did, is it came down to education, that we have to show people how these are constructed, what the actual lyrics are, what they mean, the stories they're telling. And I find now most people are generally horrified. A few years ago, you
Mhm.
definitely encountered a lot of people who would double down as this is classic American culture. I think now people are generally freaked out to recognize what we are encouraging children to sing. And so that is a very positive thing that I have been exposed to. But I think your instinct was exactly right.
Yeah, it's really powerful the way in which it melted down to something innocent seeming, but really has that underlayer.
Yeah.
This question is also asking about the cartoons. So it's asking if companies like WB have come to terms with those images and songs. Has it been brought to their attention? Yes, it has. Um, they said, I remember watching this stuff as a kid in the 80s and 90s and often discuss it with my students.
Yeah. So what's fascinating is a lot of these songs are first created in sheet music form in Tin Pan Alley by the Whitmark Company and a few others that then, during the Great Depression, Warner Brothers buys out. And so that is how you get these sort of major blackface songs, along with the ones that are in public domain, as the soundtrack to things like
Mhm.
Looney Tunes. Songs like Dixie, for example, are all over both Disney and Warner Brothers. The first synchronized sound animation series,
Yeah.
Steamboat Willie with Mickey Mouse,
Hmm.
is to the Zip Coon song. And so there's sort of no escaping the ways in which these are directly related. Um, Disney, I would say, is not as forthcoming about the roots of blackface minstrelsy and Mickey Mouse, but Warner Brothers has actually done a lot. So Warner Brothers got to the point of removing Looney Tunes from television for a long time. Then they put it on streaming with sort of contextualized warnings at the beginning. But I do think that this is something that someone really would be an outstanding project, would be to fully track how all of that seamlessly was transferred. Um, and Other ways too, like the soundtrack for Gone with the Wind, for example, has a lot of
Hmm.
those songs integrated into the
Yeah.
soundtrack.
It's really powerful. And advertising, the way that, because I talked about how laundry soap was,
Yeah.
basically like a form of minstrel, and they would give out minstrel cards and cartoons when you bought laundry soap. And it was all over the culture. And as you mentioned, Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben and all of those things that were very recently part of sort of advertising culture for so many products too. So it's not just those cartoons. This Someone asked, were there resources that you wanted to access beyond the Elks example that you gave that you couldn't? It
Yes.
sounded like there were significant hurdles in your process.
I have an entire chapter where I reconstruct a single show for a program that I was very aggressively denied. And it's sort of so I will say that the book is sort of structured with there is an introduction, and then there's sort of three overlying chapters that give overviews. And then the
Hmm.
second half of the book goes into deep dives of individual people through more narrative history of their experiences. And one of the first chapters that pivots towards that more narrative history is a story about a man who is affiliated with President Roosevelt, who was there, Graham Jackson, the day that FDR died in Warm
Hmm.
Springs, Georgia. And the
Preferably go to a minstrel show.
yeah, so there's a really famous photograph of Graham Jackson that in our parlance today goes viral and is really
Hmm.
kind of the visual way that a lot of Americans learn that the man who got them through the Great Depression and World War II dies at the height of April 1945. The war is still
Hmm.
going on. We haven't yet dropped
Hmm.
the bombs in Japan. And it's a photograph of Graham Jackson looking to the skies, crying, playing his accordion while wearing his World War II naval uniform. And I was sort of like, why is he there? Like, it doesn't make any sense why he's there in this moment because everyone else is white and with the federal
Mhm.
government or are the children who are at the polio ward. And so, a disturbing thing that I learned over the course of very aggressive research is Blackface minstrel shows, specifically the representation of jumping Jim Crow, was central to medical history. And FDR really fervently believed that children who were stricken with polio should perform blackface because the character was also portrayed as being disabled and that these children could perform the choreography in a more superior way. It's complicated, and the book goes into like histories of
Mhm.
therapeutic medicine and why he thought this. But there was a program for the minstrel show that FDR helped co-write with Graham Jackson that was supposed to be performed on his last day on Earth. And it used to be in all of these Roosevelt exhibitions, but
Mhm.
about 15 years ago disappeared. I know that there are people in private collections who have it, because there
Mhm.
were hundreds of people there that day. Where it is, I don't know. Maybe it'll pop up. But I went through crazy sort of stories dealing with the park rangers there who would say, "Oh, I just don't know where that went up and went to," and all just like crazy ways trying to divert me.
Mhm.
And so what I had to ultimately do was reconstruct it piece by piece without the program.
Mhm. It's really powerful to think about the ways in which ephemera, so often contain the things that historians need to remake what life was like and what those contexts were. So I know it's always a battle for us to find those little bits and pieces that help you to retell the story. So it's really powerful. So I think this could be our last question. It says from K-pop to country music to TikTok dances, contemporary Black music and dance culture continues to be taken without attribution, respect, or compensation to Black artists or Black culture. What do you see in contemporary American and or global pop culture that mirrors what you have researched on the 19th and 20th centuries?
Yeah. So one thing I should say in terms of the success of the civil rights movement, part of why it was so hard for me to get that ephemera, just to wrap up the last question, was
Mhm.
because these Black civil rights workers were so successful in helping Americans understand its taboo nature. And the other thing that they do in transitioning to your question about music and dance is they tell the federal government, if you want to understand the true American cultural global export, it's jazz. It's not
Mhm.
blackface.
Yes.
So that's sort of a helpful thing to footnote. But in terms of how I see it manifest today, I mean, unfortunately, globally, blackface minstrel shows do continue. There's all kinds of crazy stories of people like Reverend, Al Jackson going to places like South Africa and encountering them. And so they continue. But I think primarily it's hip hop culture right now. That would be the largest, most dominant form of this constant appropriation. And then, as you mentioned, on internet culture, there is the sort of use of memes and um, sort of slang and other ways in which white Americans are sort of inhabiting blackness to express their own emotions and humor. Um, but I will say it is not the mass commercialized form that it had been in Jim Crow. That is something the civil rights workers are absolutely successful with in terms of, yes, the stereotypes continue, but you're not having every school in America sit down and do this for an hour a week, and make millions and millions of dollars that are then invested into, building community swimming pools. So I would say that there has absolutely been amazing progress.
Mhm. So, I said that was the last question. It's not. Can you say more about how you're thinking about Americanness and whiteness in relationship to Blackface? They're especially interested in examples of non-white minstrels that participated in the practice.
Absolutely. So I have a chapter, and so performance scholars had known through photography that blackface minstrel shows and Stephen Foster music were a part of the Japanese American concentration camps. And I developed an entire chapter looking at that. And that was really the moment when I realized that this was about Americanness and not whiteness, because the only
Mhm.
reason that you have 120,000 Japanese American and Japanese people being mass incarcerated during World War II is exactly because they are seen as not white, and that something about their heritage makes them inherently alien and suspect. In those shows, it is also incredibly complex because in the moment, in the 1850s, when the United States goes to Tokyo and opens Tokyo Bay, um,
Mhm.
the first thing that the US Navy does in the 19th century is perform a huge minstrel show for um, the Japanese people. And so you also have this intergenerational handing down of
Mhm.
Stephen Foster music and blackface minstrel shows in Japan, which then they bring to places like Korea in their own imperial expansion. It
Mhm.
manifests in China, both through the sort of Pacific world, but also through the British Empire in places like what will become Singapore and other parts in mainland China. And so, what's fascinating in all of those manifestations is they are very um, directly saying that they are doing this because they are trying to fight for American identity or
Yeah.
British identity in the case of China.
Yeah, it's really powerful. Um I think in terms of thinking about the ways in which race is taught, and this history becomes a transcript by which an American version of race is really becomes a script by which many people are talking about what it means to be American, what it means to be othered,
Mhm.
and how you can be included. I thought that was such a really powerful addition to a history that I wasn't familiar with at all.
Mhm.
So, so I spoke too soon because our Q&A goes until um, the 20th of the next hour. So we have more time from our audience. So if people still have more questions, they can feel free to add them to the chat and I'll get them. So someone asked a really evocative question. Is there a difference between Snoop Dogg and Step and Fetch It?
Well, I'm a fan of Snoop Dogg, but yeah, I can see what I mean, the term, the insider term like Darkology that they would use is basically cooning,
Mhm.
the ways in which you are playing up certain elements of racial representation and stereotyping for professional gain. And so not just to focus on Snoop Dogg, but the book is really interested in the ways in which all Black performers, anytime you go to an audition, for example, you have to make choices of how do I, use my voice? How do I carry my body? How do I dress? What is costuming going to try and do to me? Will there be a hairstylist who knows how to work with my hair? And so
Mhm.
I think that question that you're sort of narrowing down is something that I think is interesting on a larger scale. And I've had a lot of people who are engaged in MFA programs, for example, who say that the book is really helpful for them to have sort of an arsenal to say, well, actually, I'm
Mhm.
not going to do that. And like, let me tell you why. And sort of the
Yeah.
um, historical weight that's being reanimated when you ask me to do that.
I always, when I first started teaching, there was a show called Flavor of Love that was on TV with Flavor Flav from Public Enemy, and he
Yeah.
was had this dating show that he did with different women. And I always taught my students, I was like, he's playing Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And that the whole gag is that he shows up with these women in, very nice spaces and he doesn't know that he's not appropriately behaving or dressed for the occasions. And that's the gag. And I thought it was something really powerful about the ways in which once we get these scripts in our American heads, that they become the way that we tell stories again and again. They become the scripts that are naturally and easily funny for us. And that to undo them is to know this history. and to be familiar with the ways in which that's an old story that's built on white supremacy and this idea of Black inferiority. I think, you know, as you said, all Black performance has to be careful and thoughtful about not being pushed toward diving into those old scripts once again.
Absolutely.
Let me see if there's any other questions. I don't think there's any other questions in the chat that I missed. So what do you hope audiences will take away from these conversations? What readers will get from the book? You mentioned in terms of being a way to sort of push back on contemporary culture. What are some other things that you hope will come from the conversations that grow out of Darkology?
Yeah, so I certainly hope that it can empower all Americans in terms of understanding how these stereotypes are constructed, but also the ways in which they built and fortified our built environment. Um, One thing I talk about at towards the end of the book is, for example, the welcome signs that are at most city limits that say, we have the
Mhm.
Elks Club, we have the Rotary
Yeah.
Club. And to us today, they're sort of seen as innocuous or quaint. But during the Great Migration, for Black Americans and also for Jewish Americans, they were basically akin to sundown signs, basically saying,
Yes.
keep moving. You're not going to be welcome in the political economy here. And there might be real trouble for you here.
Mhm.
And so that's sort of just another example of how I hope that we can all learn to look at the world around us and familiar objects and see them for the full being of what they have been historically.
Mhm.
Um, I also in the book tried to make a lot of the analysis and labor visual when talking about the books in terms of how I read them as objects. And I really only did that because I know that millions of Americans will encounter these objects in their lifetimes, whether you're cleaning out your grandmother's home or
Mhm.
you're going with your child to a school library. And
Mhm.
so I wanted Americans to know how to read and understand their own history in this larger context so that perhaps you could do a community project about how Blackface impacted your K through 12 school or your church or the civil rights struggles locally against it. And
Yeah.
so I also hope in the ways in which, like we have the slavery and university programs, I've written to a lot of
Mhm.
those programs and said, your university actually had blackface longer than it had American slavery, and those things work together, right? That they are
Mhm.
perpetuating the ghost of slavery and
Mhm.
strengthening it while also negating the history and erasure of what actually happened to those enslaved people on campus. So I also hope that those programs will look into the role blackface played.
Yeah. One of the questions is tapping into exactly that, saying, do you feel minstrelsy was sane washing the horrors of slavery, making it humorous? And did that play into the longevity of this form? And this person said they're halfway through your book and they're fascinated by it. And thank you for being a great writer.
Oh, thank you. Okay, let me read it again. How do you feel minstrelsy was a form of collective, is it sane washing or brainwashing?
Sane washing is what they say,
Yeah. So, I mean, and this
which
is
I've not heard before.
building off of some of the work of some really amazing young uh, Black women historians, is the ways in which they have been trying to piece together, as I sort of mentioned, the role of performance and its centrality in slavery and the original stereotypes of being lively and looking happy-go-lucky and those forms of performances, and then the ways that it manifests in American slavery. So I think, yeah, there's an absolute direct through line for the University of Vermont chapter, which their annual event was called Cakewalk.
Hmm.
I called the chapter Sugarcoating Slavery for this exact reason that they're trying
Hmm.
to whitewash what actually happened. And a lot of the students who were horrified by Cakewalk go back to the slavery archive to try and understand what actually was a cakewalk, because that's not a term that was used
Yeah.
by enslaved people or in the WPA narratives. And it's really recreating the experience of enslaved people who are forced to dance or perform on a starvation ration diet to access sugar-based products, which is ironic because so much of slavery is tied in the production of sugar, but most enslaved people are living off of cornmeal-based
Mhm.
diets. And so the ways in which that becomes a cute game for children to dance for a cake is
Mhm.
actually recreating a really disturbing form of torture.
Mhm.
And so there's another sort of example of how there's a very direct connection that we kind of lost in the translation.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it was even lost for Black Southerners. They create cakewalks that are like more like the
Circles.
game where you take away the chair and you win a cake
Yeah.
if you're the last dancer.
Yeah, musical
Um,
chair.
yeah. So a graduate student is on the chat and said, "Thanks so much for the talk. You've mentioned the reoccurrence afterlives of minstrelsy and blackface tropes in other forms of media, music, advertising, drama, music, and movies. Do you see these tropes reoccurring in fiction, literary fiction, or mass fiction?"
I think the most famous example right now is James. That's sort of the watershed recent example in literature. But yeah, I mean, one thing that I had to have a lot of conversations with about the publishers in my own writing was the fact that I am not a Black author. And so the way you market this, the way you perhaps use images on book covers, and then also in terms of the audio book became really
Mhm.
important for me. I have not yet heard the final product, but they had hired a white woman to essentially be my voice. And I said, cool, but the two chapters that are based on oral history of Black women, you need a Black narrator, a Black woman narrator for those things. And I think that those are the kinds of conversations in literature that are really happening in fiction writing, in script writing today. And we're seeing the
Mhm.
reckoning with that, which isn't to say that you can't write those characters, but that it needs to be based in something that's realistic, and
Mhm.
perhaps through lived experience as opposed to just relying on these tropes that we see again and again.
Yeah, I've heard some really horrible audiobooks that were not thoughtful at all about those complications. So thanks for thinking about that in preparation. Given that minstrelsy was the foundation of American musical theater, how do you see that legacy evolving? Is it incumbent on dramaturgy to supplement the audience experience? Where do you see research like yours being most effective in this space?
I had a really interesting meeting with graduate students at UC Santa Barbara last week who are actually were originally coming at this in terms of reading plays like Othello, for example, where blackface was used, and now they have formed a theater company where they're trying to study the ethical performance and staging of historical plays and
Mhm.
really having those conversations. My answer is always if you are using these, texts or showing these movies, that there needs to be really serious contextualization. I don't advocate for censoring. I think part of the reason why we didn't understand the true full-blown power of blackface was because the history itself had been censored for positive and negative reasons. Um, but I think how that contextualization takes place and who does it is interesting. I mean, I've also noticed a lot of times I really drive home the fact that this is a white supremacist genre because a lot of times I find that producers or other groups of decision makers will say, "Oh, we need a black person to translate this," and I'm like, "Uh,
Not black text.
yeah, it's not black created. It's black like horror essentially. Why is it their job to teach white audiences what white people created and did?" And so
Hmm.
whenever I get the question of do you feel weird doing a Black history? I'm like, it's not a Black history, it's white supremacist history.
Hmm.
And so I think, and that goes back to the sort of Black Americana idea. Um,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think just going back to the issues of drama, it's just all about contextualization, having those conversations, and you can do
Mhm.
that with the audience. You could have something
Mhm.
said at the beginning and then afterwards do a talk back. There's a lot of
Mhm.
different ways to approach it.
Yeah, just drawing in the expertise.
Hmm.
Um, this question says, I'm wondering about the fact that blackface figures so heavily in many of the works considered hallmarks of early cinema. Are there any specific ways you introduce this material to give context to students? Are there any other more challenging, subversive examples? I'm interested in your mention of Black people performing in satire.
Hmm. Yeah, so going back to the ways in which blackface was central to bringing in new forms of technology, the most famous example being Birth of a Nation for silent film narrative saga.
Mhm.
But then for talkies, it's the jazz singer, which as a technological device is quite interesting because it still does have story placards, but you do have synchronized sound in which Al Jolson is performing Mammy and all kinds of different
Mhm.
blackface classics. And so really, I mean, through the 1960s, the use of blackface is incredibly prevalent. Amos and Andy is also an interesting for television history to use with
Yeah.
students. I'll keep thinking about the specific satire for Black performances, but I think people like Paul Robeson, for example, were so aggressive in pushing back and saying, "I will not perform in these stereotypes."
Mhm.
And using things like Showboat to try and show more complexity. Um,
Mhm.
but I think for the sort of true genius of the subversiveness, I think Burt Williams, I think Bob Cole, a lot of that sort of early 20th century generation that's bridging Broadway into early film and cinema, um, are really profound at doing this, uh,
Mhm.
and sort of performing to different registers.
Yeah. I think I remember Sammy Davis Jr. talking about his performances and the ways in which he had to build another kind of career coming out of what he was forced to do as a child.
Absolutely.
There might be something there too. I skipped a question by accident. If there is one resource that you would recommend for teachers to use when teaching about this history, what would it be beside your book?
Sure. So I did create some guides on US history scene. I also did one with the Washington Post, and I did one for the New York City Department of Education. So those will pop up online and they're free. Um, if you want to use a primary source reader, there's a book called Inside the Minstrel Mask. And it was put together by a lot of these sort of famous first generation um, blackface scholars like Eric Lott. And it has excerpts from the songs, from the plays, from the photography and the lithographs, and I think along with companion essays, and I think that they're fantastic for students because it's really, really, really hard to understand this history if you've never seen it.
Mhm.
And so, and once again, going back to contextualizing, preparing students instead of just plopping this material in front of them, um, is part of the care work that goes into that education process.
Yeah. I also think that the songs themselves that will be familiar to them, having that script made clear is also been really revelatory. I've never taught K through 12, but for college students in a general survey course, they were like, struck by knowing the tunes of minstrelsy.
Mhm.
It really
Absolutely.
made the case in such an interesting way for them. Um, a question. I'm writing about the use of blackface in shows performed in Utah's national parks in the mid 20th century. You mentioned another national park earlier. Is this something you've seen in more national parks?
Yes, any federal space. The CCC used it constantly, so pretty much any federal space you will find blackface as it was required of the workers.
Hmm. And so, our last question. Thank you, Dr. Barnes. I look forward to reading your book. I was wondering if you have any reflections or queries about blackface and contemporary cases of racial impersonation, if relevant, including pretendians and yellowface.
Yeah, so I would say that there's a book just called Yellowface, and I think for the Native American red face question, Phil Delorier is playing Indians and Indians in Unexpected Places are the two resources that I always teach.
Great. Well, I think we're done with our question and answer time. And I thank you so much for this. And so I believe I have already announced the book winners, but just in case anyone didn't hear, let me scroll back and say the book winners were Kara Smelter, James Ward, and Sylvia Tamash. And you'll be receiving your books. And we are so thrilled that we could host this conversation with a scholar who has been part of our centers, who's taken advantage of the time and respite that's so necessary for this kind of work. This really careful thinking about historical texts and putting it together and writing that you experience at Stanford, and also the ways in which we care about, sharing this message and being available for our K through 12 spaces and for teaching spaces in general through our education program. So I'm so thankful to you for being such a great example of what the space for the humanities can really mean. So thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for you guys. Book would not exist without high school.
Yes. And so let me see if anyone else is supposed to say anything. I don't think so. I think this is the end of our webinar, and I'm so thrilled to be connected to you and have this great chance to read your book and to be in conversation. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's an honor.
All right. See you next time.